Between 1952 and 2007, the Savannah River site operated under one of the most comprehensive radiation monitoring and documentation systems ever implemented at an American nuclear facility. Thousands of incident reports, exposure records, and safety investigations generated an archive that appeared to demonstrate transparent accountability. Construction workers, operations personnel, and health physics technicians followed documented procedures. Radiation monitoring equipment functioned within specifications. Incident reporting protocols operated as designed. Yet beneath this facade of comprehensive documentation, critical data about nuclear criticality risks and worker exposures systematically disappeared into institutional gaps that were never officially acknowledged. Not through deliberate concealment, but through a reporting architecture that created legitimate channels for exclusion. The same procedural framework that mandated extensive record-keeping also defined categories of events that did not require documentation. Workers operated within monitoring systems that appeared comprehensive while generating systematic blind spots in coverage. This analysis reconstructs how institutional design choices, embedded within the earliest operational protocols, shaped what information survived and what vanished. When construction workers entered radiological areas without health physics coverage, when incidents occurred during shift changes, when contamination events fell below arbitrary reporting thresholds, the documentation system functioned exactly as intended. The missing data was not lost. It was never captured by design. How can a system built for transparency systematically exclude the information most critical to public safety? The Savannah River site represented the pinnacle of 1950s nuclear engineering confidence. 5 production reactors, 2 chemical separation facilities, multiple waste tank farms, and supporting infrastructure spread across 310 square miles of South Carolina wilderness. The facility's mission, producing plutonium and tritium for the nuclear weapons program, demanded operational controls that could manage both the physics of fissile material and the politics of public accountability. DuPont's management contract established a dual reporting architecture that would prove fundamentally flawed. The company would operate the site under Atomic Energy Commission oversight while maintaining operational independence through established industrial safety practices. This arrangement embedded a critical tension within the documentation system. Comprehensive records would demonstrate safety compliance, but operational flexibility required discretionary boundaries around what constituted recordable events. The institutional framework established 3 distinct organizational layers, each operating under different monitoring requirements and reporting protocols. Health physics technicians monitored radiation fields and contamination levels according to established radiological control procedures. Operations personnel executed procedures designed to maintain production schedules while ensuring nuclear safety. Construction and maintenance workers, both in-house and contracted, performed the physical modifications that kept aging systems operational under increasingly demanding conditions. The fundamental design premise held that adequate monitoring could be achieved through representative sampling, rather than comprehensive coverage. This assumption seemed reasonable within the resource constraints of the 1950s nuclear program. Not every worker required personal dosimetry if representative samples could characterize exposure patterns across similar job categories. Not every task needed health physics oversight if standard procedures could control radiological hazards within acceptable limits. Not every contamination event warranted formal documentation if local cleanup could restore safe working conditions. The Special Hazards Investigation Database exemplified this selective documentation approach. Created primarily for safety analysis purposes, it compiled major incidents from shift logbooks while systematically filtering out routine contamination events. The database served its intended function of supporting safety analyses for equipment reliability and process improvements. Yet the filtering criteria that made it useful for engineering analysis made it inadequate for comprehensive exposure reconstruction. An SRS official later described the selection process to NIOSH investigators. The database compiler consistently read the logbooks and copied materials he deemed notable. The professional judgment of what constituted notable became the primary filter determining what information would be preserved for future analysis. This judgment was not arbitrary. It reflected engineering priorities that focused on events with immediate operational consequences while treating personnel exposures as routine administrative matters requiring less comprehensive documentation. The tank farm fault tree databanks operated under similar selective principles. These databases acknowledged explicitly that prior to 1965 information on instrument failure, pump failure, leaks in the waste tank system are not recorded unless the individual occurrence is of particular interest. The frequency of recorded incidents increased dramatically over time, from approximately 4 entries per year in the 1950s to 1,800 per year by 1982, not because incident rates increased, but because the institutional definition of what warranted recording gradually expanded in response to changing analytical requirements. This expansion revealed the retrospective inadequacy of the original selection criteria without providing any method for reconstructing the information that had been systematically excluded during the earlier periods. The institutional system had optimized for current operational needs, rather than future analytical requirements that could not be anticipated during the initial design phase. The radiological control system reflected these same efficiency-driven design choices. Personal dosimetry was assigned based on job classifications and primary work locations rather than actual exposure potential during specific tasks. Workers classified as performing non-radiological maintenance might not receive dosimeters even when working in contaminated environments if their job descriptions did not explicitly require radiological work. This classification system reduced administrative burden while creating systematic gaps in exposure monitoring for workers whose actual duties crossed the boundaries between radiological and non-radiological work areas. Construction workers represented the most problematic population within this classification framework. Unlike operations personnel who worked in stable, well-characterized environments under consistent administrative controls, construction workers moved frequently between areas with different contamination characteristics. They performed non-routine tasks that generated exposure pathways not addressed in standard operating procedures. Their employment patterns meant that cumulative exposures accumulated across multiple short-term projects rather than continuous long-term assignments under unified monitoring programs. The Davis-Bacon Act created additional complications through its exemption for federal contracts under $2,500. This exemption encouraged the administrative fragmentation of larger construction projects into smaller, legally independent tasks that could avoid federal contracting requirements, including prevailing wage provisions. The resulting project structure systematically excluded many construction workers from the comprehensive monitoring programs that applied to direct federal employees and major contractors. The regulatory environment itself contained fundamental design flaws that enabled these systematic gaps to persist without external detection. Multiple federal agencies exercised oversight responsibility through different legal authorities that created significant gaps in comprehensive facility monitoring. The Atomic Energy Commission focused on nuclear safety and security issues. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration addressed industrial safety concerns. The Environmental Protection Agency monitored environmental releases and contamination, yet no single agency possessed comprehensive authority or analytical capability to evaluate the integrated effectiveness of worker protection programs across all these domains. Each agency optimized its oversight activities for its specific regulatory responsibilities, without systematic coordination with other agencies or comprehensive analysis of potential gaps between their respective jurisdictions. The result was a regulatory framework that could identify specific violations within individual regulatory domains while missing systematic problems that emerged from the interactions between different regulatory requirements. The documentation systems reflected these jurisdictional boundaries through database structures that were optimized for specific regulatory reporting requirements rather than comprehensive exposure analysis. Incident reports focused on immediate operational consequences and regulatory compliance rather than long-term health implications. Equipment failure databases tracked mechanical reliability and process performance without systematic integration of personnel exposure information. Health physics records documented individual exposures for administrative purposes without comprehensive analysis of exposure patterns across different worker populations or work environments. The institutional assumption that these separate systems could be integrated retrospectively for comprehensive health analysis proved fundamentally flawed. Each database operated under different selection criteria, different documentation standards, and different preservation requirements. The missing information represented not accidental losses, but systematic exclusions based on criteria that seemed reasonable within each database's original purpose, but that created dangerous gaps when comprehensive exposure reconstruction became necessary decades later. The design philosophy that prioritized operational efficiency over comprehensive documentation created predictable vulnerabilities that would only become visible when epidemiological analysis required the complete exposure histories that the original systems had never been designed to preserve. The institutional framework had embedded a false assumption that selective documentation could adequately support any future analytical requirement that might emerge from changing regulatory or scientific demands. This assumption failed because operational significance does not correlate with health significance across the temporal scales relevant to occupational disease development. Events that seemed routine at the time could prove critical for understanding cumulative exposure patterns decades later. Equipment failures that could be quickly repaired might generate significant personnel exposures that would only become medically relevant years after the incident occurred. The systematic nature of these documentation gaps meant that they could not be addressed through improved procedures or expanded record-keeping without fundamental changes in institutional priorities and resource allocation. The missing information was not lost through negligence. It was systematically excluded through design choices that reflected rational institutional priorities within the constraints and knowledge available during the facility's operational period. The institutional architecture governing Savannah River site operations contained multiple latent failure pathways that remained dormant until activated by specific operational conditions. These vulnerabilities were not design flaws in the conventional sense. They represented predictable consequences of rational organizational choices made under resource constraints and competing priorities. The system's failure emerged when routine operational conditions activated these latent vulnerabilities in combinations that the original designers had not anticipated. Construction workers occupied the most precarious position within this institutional framework due to fundamental misalignments between their actual work patterns and the administrative categories that governed their radiation protection. The Davis-Bacon Act exemption for projects under $2,500 created powerful financial incentives to fragment larger construction activities into smaller, legally independent tasks. This administrative structure enabled site management to avoid federal prevailing wage requirements while simultaneously excluding many construction workers from the comprehensive monitoring programs that applied to permanent facility personnel. The documented evidence from worker interviews reveals the practical consequences of this administrative fragmentation. Construction workers frequently performed radiological work under job classifications that did not require routine dosimetry because their tasks were administratively categorized as non-radiological maintenance, despite involving direct contact with contaminated systems and environments. The March 14, 1979, Tank Farm Databank entry exemplifies this systematic gap. Construction worker got 8,000 degrees Celsius M-beta gamma on gloves, worked in 241 F-regulated area without health physics coverage. This incident was not an isolated procedural violation, but a predictable consequence of resource allocation decisions embedded within the facility's operational structure. Health physics coverage during day shifts was adequate for operations personnel working in established locations under routine conditions. The same staffing levels proved inadequate when construction activities required simultaneous coverage across multiple work sites with varying contamination levels and changing operational conditions. The health physics staffing pattern concentrated resources during normal business hours when administrative oversight was most comprehensive and when most major maintenance activities were scheduled. This allocation seemed rational from an operational perspective because it maximized coverage during periods of highest activity and administrative visibility. Yet it systematically underserved construction workers who often performed critical safety-related maintenance during off shifts when coverage was minimal. Worker interview evidence documents this pattern extensively. HP couldn't cover everything at the tank farms because there were not enough personnel. In the early 1980s, there were 6 to 7 people on the day shift, covering a couple hundred workers. One HP would stay in the trailer. They were short-staffed all the time. The mathematical impossibility of continuous coverage under these staffing ratios meant that workers routinely operated without the health physics oversight that institutional procedures assumed would be available. The informal prioritization systems that developed to manage these resource constraints created systematic biases that disadvantaged construction workers relative to operations personnel. Health physics technicians learned to focus their limited resources on work activities that pose the highest immediate radiological risks or that involved the most experienced personnel who could work efficiently under radiation protection constraints. Construction workers, who often lacked facility-specific training and who performed non-routine tasks requiring extended time in contaminated areas, received lower priority despite potentially facing higher cumulative exposures. The training programs reflected and reinforced these organizational hierarchies through curricula that emphasized different priorities for different worker populations. Operations personnel received comprehensive instruction in plant systems, radiation protection procedures, and emergency response protocols that assumed continuous health physics support and established contamination control procedures. Construction workers received basic radiation awareness training focused on hazard recognition rather than independent decision-making under radiological conditions. This training differential created dangerous gaps when construction workers encountered radiological conditions that exceeded the scope of their basic awareness training without having access to the health physics consultation that more comprehensive training assumed would be available. The documented pattern of construction workers learning radiation protection practices through informal mentoring from experienced personnel represented an uncontrolled knowledge transfer process that could not ensure consistent or adequate protection across different work assignments. The procedural structure embedded additional systematic biases that became hazardous under routine operational conditions. Written procedures emphasized preventing the highest consequence accidents, particularly criticality incidents and large-scale contamination releases that could threaten facility-wide operations. This emphasis was appropriate for managing the most dangerous scenarios, but it created systematic neglect of cumulative exposure pathways that developed through routine maintenance activities over extended time periods. Worker accounts document how procedures optimized for preventing major accidents could inadvertently increase routine exposures. At the tank farms, a maintenance crew worked about 50% of the time without an HP. You would not take an HP when you were going to do things your way. This pattern reflected rational decision-making by experienced workers who understood that calling for health physics support could delay critical maintenance work while triggering comprehensive surveys that often revealed additional contamination requiring extensive cleanup activities. The institutional culture that rewarded problem-solving and operational flexibility created systematic disincentives for conservative radiation protection practices. Workers learned that reporting contamination incidents triggered investigation procedures that could halt productive work for indefinite periods. Supervisors learned that requesting additional health physics support could delay critical maintenance beyond acceptable limits. The result was an informal system where many radiological issues were managed through local resources rather than comprehensive institutional procedures. The badge assignment and storage procedures exemplified how operational convenience systematically undermined monitoring effectiveness. The tank farm databank contains multiple references to workers operating without proper dosimetry, 3 workers exposed to CTS loop, no badges. Worker interviews describe badge storage facilities at H area as aluminum sheds with no walls where dosimeters were exposed to weather and contaminated vehicle traffic that could compromise their accuracy. The monthly badge exchange system created additional systematic gaps during transition periods. Workers often continued operating with expired badges when exchanges were delayed over weekends or during holiday periods. The temporary badge system for workers moving between areas operated without systematic tracking, creating opportunities for workers to operate without any dosimetry when temporary badges were unavailable or when workers forgot to obtain them during area transfers. The contamination control procedures contained similar systematic vulnerabilities that became activated under routine operational conditions. Workers learned to survey protective clothing before use because laundered items frequently returned from cleaning facilities with residual contamination levels that exceeded acceptable limits. This informal pre-use surveying represented an uncontrolled quality control process that depended on worker initiative rather than systematic institutional oversight. The boundary between contamination levels requiring formal decontamination versus informal cleanup was never clearly defined in operational procedures. Workers developed informal guidelines based on experience and local conditions rather than systematic institutional standards. This flexibility enabled efficient management of routine contamination events, but created opportunities for significant exposures when workers encountered contamination levels that exceeded their informal decision criteria without having access to health physics consultation. The shift-based operational structure created the most systematic vulnerabilities by concentrating supervisory resources and administrative oversight during normal business hours while leaving night and weekend operations with minimal coverage. The documented evidence shows that incident reporting patterns reflected this resource distribution. If you look at incident reports, the incidents are mostly during the daytime. Operations would just clean up other spills at night, and a lot of stuff never got reported. This pattern was not the result of deliberate concealment, but a predictable consequence of resource allocation decisions that prioritized administrative convenience over comprehensive documentation. Night shift supervisors lacked the administrative support necessary for complex incident reporting, while facing schedule pressures that made informal problem resolution more attractive than formal procedures requiring extensive coordination with day shift management. The equipment maintenance schedules that required around-the-clock work during reactor outages and major system repairs created the most dangerous activation conditions for these latent vulnerabilities. Extended work periods under schedule pressure, combined with reduced supervisory coverage and limited health physics support to create predictable scenarios where experienced workers made independent decisions about radiation protection practices that could produce significant exposures without triggering the institutional oversight that normal procedures assumed would be available. These latent conditions aligned most destructively during specific operational scenarios that the institutional design had not adequately considered: construction work during off shifts, maintenance activities in areas where contamination levels exceeded design assumptions, emergency repairs where schedule pressures overrode normal radiological controls, and routine tasks performed by inexperienced workers without adequate mentoring or health physics support. The systematic nature of these vulnerabilities meant that they produced predictable failures under routine operational conditions rather than requiring extraordinary circumstances or individual negligence. The institutional system created pathways for experienced, well-trained personnel to make rational decisions that produced irrational exposure outcomes through mechanisms that remained invisible, until comprehensive retrospective analysis revealed the patterns that individual incidents had not disclosed. The institutional failures at Savannah River site were not triggered by extraordinary circumstances or catastrophic equipment malfunctions. Instead, they emerged through the routine activation of systematic vulnerabilities during normal operational conditions. The documentation reveals a pattern where everyday maintenance activities, standard shift transitions, and routine contamination events systematically activated the latent gaps embedded within the facility's monitoring and reporting architecture. The Tank Farm Fault Tree Databank provides the most comprehensive evidence of this pattern through its documentation of incidents that were considered too routine to warrant special hazards investigation, but significant enough to record in operational databases. The March 14, 1979, incident represents a paradigmatic example. Construction worker got 8,000 degrees Celsius M-beta gamma on gloves. Worked in 241 F-regulated area without health physics coverage. This entry encapsulates the fundamental divergence between institutional assumptions and operational reality that characterized the facility's systematic documentation failures. The construction worker involved followed established procedures for accessing the F-area tank farm. Work authorization had been properly obtained through the construction liaison process. The contamination levels encountered were within the range that operations personnel routinely managed during tank farm maintenance activities. Yet the worker operated without the health physics oversight that institutional procedures explicitly assumed would be present during any work in regulated radiological areas. This incident was not a procedural violation but a predictable consequence of resource allocation decisions that concentrated health physics coverage during normal business hours, while treating off-shift and construction activities as lower priority. The contamination event itself was successfully managed through local decontamination procedures without affecting facility operations or threatening public safety. According to the institutional criteria for distinguishing between routine operational challenges and special hazards requiring comprehensive investigation, this event fell clearly within the range of normal maintenance activities. Yet the incident revealed a systematic inadequacy in the assumptions underlying radiological work planning for construction activities. The 80000 degrees Celsius M-beta-gamma contamination levels indicated significant radiological conditions that exceeded the routine contamination assumed in standard construction procedures. The absence of health physics coverage meant that the worker made independent decisions about contamination control and exposure management without the professional consultation that institutional procedures assumed would guide such decisions. The February 1979 incident involving 3 workers exposed to CTS loop, no badges, exposure estimated 65, Mr. Cause accidental removal of a fence exemplified how routine maintenance activities could generate exposures that were never captured by the facility's primary monitoring systems. The workers involved were performing authorized maintenance work under established procedures for fence removal and replacement. The exposure levels remained within acceptable limits for individual incidents. Yet the absence of personal dosimetry meant that these exposures were never recorded in the individual exposure histories that formed the foundation for cumulative dose tracking. The accidental fence removal was actually a predictable consequence of construction work in areas where temporary radiological barriers had been established without comprehensive coordination with ongoing maintenance activities. The fence had been installed to control access during previous radiological work, but had not been systematically integrated into the work planning procedures for subsequent construction activities in the same area. The removal occurred when construction workers encountered the barrier during authorized work and made independent decisions about how to proceed without the radiological consultation that such decisions required. This pattern of independent decision-making by construction workers reflected systematic gaps in the work planning process that failed to account for the complex interactions between different types of maintenance activities in radiological environments. Construction supervisors planned work based on general area radiological surveys without access to detailed information about recent contamination events, temporary radiological controls, or ongoing radiological work that could affect construction activities. The documentation system itself created perverse incentives that widen the gap between institutional expectations and operational practice. Formal incident reporting triggered investigation protocols that could halt productive work for extended periods, while requiring extensive administrative coordination between construction, operations, and health physics organizations. Contamination events that could be managed through local resources without affecting facility operations rarely justified the administrative burden associated with comprehensive incident analysis. Worker interviews document this systematic bias toward informal problem resolution. If workers made a mess, they cleaned it up. That was the way they worked. This approach reflected practical experience with radiological work rather than negligence or indifference to safety requirements. Experienced workers understood that minor contamination events could often be managed more efficiently through immediate local action than through formal procedures requiring extensive coordination and documentation. The institutional system had never clearly defined the boundary between contamination events requiring formal incident reporting and those that could be appropriately managed through routine cleanup procedures. This ambiguity created opportunities for significant exposures to occur without triggering the institutional oversight that more serious contamination events would have generated. The August 21, 1975, incident during excavation around Riser 6 Tank 3 illustrated how routine construction activities could encounter radiological conditions that invalidated fundamental assumptions underlying work planning procedures. The construction crew discovered contaminated soil reading 350 RHR at 1 inch from the steam supply line, with soil contamination levels of approximately 50 CI/CS-137, indicating a substantial previous leak that had never been systematically documented or incorporated into work planning databases. The excavation work had been planned using standard procedures that relied on current radiation surveys conducted at ground surface level. These surveys provided accurate information about existing radiation fields, but could not characterize subsurface contamination from previous leaks or spills that had been covered or contained without comprehensive documentation of their long-term implications for future construction activities. The discovery of 350 rands ter contamination during routine excavation revealed a fundamental weakness in the information architecture supporting construction work planning. Historical information about previous contamination events was not systematically integrated into current work planning procedures. Construction supervisors made decisions based on current radiological conditions without access to institutional memory about previous incidents that could create unexpected hazards during excavation or other intrusive work activities. The institutional response to such discoveries typically focused on immediate hazard mitigation, rather than systematic evaluation of how many similar undocumented contamination areas might exist throughout the facility. The contaminated excavation area would be secured, contaminated materials properly disposed of, and affected workers monitored for exposure consequences. Yet the broader implications for work planning procedures and historical contamination characterization were not systematically addressed through available analytical frameworks. The November 20, 1972, exposure during valve removal in F area demonstrated how seemingly routine maintenance could encounter conditions that exceeded the radiological assumptions underlying standard work procedures. The incident resulted in hand, face, and personal item contamination to 2,000 degrees Celsius M-beta gamma, with bioassay results showing 13 NCI cesium-137 and whole body counting detecting 84 NCI ruthenium-106 and 368 NCI cesium-137. These contamination levels indicated significant internal uptake from work that had been classified as routine valve maintenance. The significant internal contamination suggested either inadequate pre-work radiological characterization or failure of standard contamination control procedures under actual working conditions. Yet, without comprehensive incident investigation, it was impossible to determine which failure mode had occurred or how similar exposures might be prevented during future valve maintenance activities. The systematic pattern revealed through comparison of different documentation systems showed that these incidents were not isolated anomalies, but predictable consequences of institutional design choices that created systematic gaps between procedural assumptions and operational realities. The Tank Farm Fault Tree Databank contained numerous incidents involving significant exposures that had not triggered special hazards investigations because they were successfully managed through local resources without affecting broader facility operations. The fragmentation of information across multiple documentation systems meant that no single institutional entity possessed comprehensive awareness of exposure patterns that could inform systematic improvements in work planning or radiological protection procedures. Each database served its specific institutional purpose effectively, while contributing to institutional blindness about patterns that only became visible through retrospective integration of information that had never been systematically coordinated. The missing information was not concealed or lost, but systematically excluded through institutional procedures that prioritized immediate operational concerns over long-term institutional learning about exposure patterns and protection effectiveness. The result was a documentation system that could manage individual incidents effectively while remaining systematically blind to the cumulative patterns that comprehensive worker protection required. The systematic documentation failures at Savannah River site resulted from fundamental misalignments between the physics of radiological exposure and the institutional frameworks designed to monitor and control worker protection. The failure chain operated through predictable mechanisms that invalidated the basic assumptions underlying the facility's monitoring systems while remaining invisible to the institutional oversight designed to detect and correct such problems. The dosimetry assignment system exemplified this fundamental mismatch between institutional design and physical reality. Personal dosimeters were assigned based on administrative job classifications rather than actual exposure potential during specific work activities. Workers classified as performing non-radiological maintenance might not receive dosimeters even when working in highly contaminated environments, if their job descriptions did not explicitly require radiological work authorization. This administrative approach reduced bureaucratic complexity while creating systematic blindness to exposure pathways that cross the boundaries between different job classification systems. Construction workers represented the most problematic population within this framework because their work patterns violated every assumption underlying the dosimetry assignment logic. They moved frequently between areas with different contamination characteristics that could not be predicted from their nominal job classifications. They performed non-routine tasks that generated exposure pathways not addressed in standard radiological work procedures. Their employment patterns meant that significant exposures could accumulate across multiple short-term assignments without triggering the administrative oversight that continuous long-term employment would have provided. The representative sampling approach that governed monitoring system design assumed that covered workers could adequately characterize exposure patterns for uncovered populations within similar job categories. This assumption held for operations personnel who worked in stable, well-characterized environments under consistent administrative controls and established contamination patterns. It failed systematically for mobile worker populations who encountered radiological conditions that varied significantly across different work locations and time periods. The physical reality of contamination distribution throughout the facility created additional systematic challenges that the monitoring system design had not adequately addressed. Fixed monitoring stations provided accurate measurements for their specific locations, but could not characterize exposure pathways in areas between monitoring points or during work activities that disturbed previously stable contamination patterns. The documented discovery of 350 RHR contamination in subsurface soil during routine excavation demonstrated how localized contamination could exceed facility-wide survey results by orders of magnitude. This spatial variability meant that area monitoring data could not reliably predict individual worker exposures during specific work activities, particularly for construction workers who performed intrusive tasks that could encounter previously unknown contamination sources. The February 1968 Tank 1 billion evaporator pump failure generated body exposure rates of 30 rands at 18 inches during pump replacement, far exceeding the exposure rates that would be predicted from general area surveys of the tank farm environment. The temporal aspects of contamination patterns created additional systematic inadequacies in the monitoring system design. Contamination levels could change rapidly due to ongoing operations, equipment failures, or weather conditions that redistributed surface contamination. Work planning based on historical survey data could not account for these dynamic changes, particularly during off shifts when systematic resurveying was not routinely performed. The July 1971 exposure of 3.4 R, while lightning packing glands resulted from high radiation levels in feed pump enclosure that had not been adequately characterized before work began. The total exposure of 3.4 R approached annual regulatory limits for what had been classified as routine maintenance activity. This incident demonstrated how equipment-specific contamination could create localized exposure conditions that exceeded both area monitoring predictions and procedural assumptions about routine maintenance work. The contamination monitoring system contained systematic gaps that became critical when activated by routine maintenance activities. Handheld survey equipment was available in work areas, but workers were expected to use it voluntarily rather than under systematic, procedural requirements, or health physics oversight. The boundary between contamination levels requiring formal decontamination procedures and those that could be managed through informal cleanup was never clearly defined in operational guidance. Worker interviews document how this ambiguity created systematic exposure pathways. When pulling dip samples at the tank farms, workers had to put a cap on the sample while wearing gloves. The cap had coarse threads. It was not unusual to drop a cap in the tank or drop the cap and contaminate a riser with high-level waste. Old-school people would come and clean up. This was not thought of as an incident. This pattern of informal contamination management represented a systematic exposure pathway that was never captured in incident reporting systems or individual exposure records. Workers routinely encountered contamination events that exceeded normal working conditions but that fell below the institutional thresholds for formal incident reporting. The cumulative exposure potential from multiple such events could not be characterized through existing monitoring systems. The internal contamination incidents revealed the most serious inadequacies in the monitoring system design because they indicated exposure pathways that could not be detected through external monitoring or routine area surveys. The November 20, 1972, incident involving bioassay results of 13 NCICS 137 and whole body counting, detecting 84 NCI-RU 106 and 300 and 68 NCI-CS 137 during valve removal demonstrated significant internal uptake from work that had been classified as routine maintenance. These contamination levels approached 2% of the maximum permissible body burden, indicating that either pre-work radiological characterization had been inadequate or that standard contamination control procedures had failed under actual working conditions. The systematic exclusion of this incident from the Special Hazards Investigation database meant that no comprehensive analysis was performed to determine which failure mode had occurred or how similar exposures might be prevented. The February 28, 1974, liquid spray incident in H area provided additional evidence of systematic inadequacies in contamination control procedures. The incident involved contaminated liquid spraying from a leak onto maintenance personnel, resulting in nasal contamination up to 1,345 dm and body contamination to 300 mrhr at 2 inches. Bioassay results showed 12 NCI and 64 NCI-CS 137 for the 2 affected workers, with 1 worker receiving approximately 2% of the maximum permissible body burden. This incident occurred during routine maintenance work and was successfully managed through established decontamination procedures without affecting broader facility operations. Yet it demonstrated how process upsets could generate internal contamination through inhalation and skin contact pathways that were not adequately controlled by standard work procedures. The spray mechanism indicated that contamination could be dispersed beyond the immediate work area through mechanisms that standard containment procedures had not anticipated. The systematic pattern that emerged from analysis of documented incidents showed that significant exposures occurred routinely during work that was classified as normal maintenance rather than special radiological work requiring enhanced protection measures. The exposure levels involved often approached or exceeded regulatory limits for individual incidents while remaining below the institutional thresholds for comprehensive investigation and analysis. This pattern reflected a fundamental mismatch between regulatory frameworks that focused on individual dose limits and institutional procedures that focused on operational consequences rather than cumulative health implications. Work could generate significant individual exposures without triggering institutional oversight if it could be completed successfully, without affecting production schedules or requiring external assistance. The physics of dose accumulation created additional systematic challenges that the institutional framework was not designed to address. Individual exposures that remained within acceptable limits for single incidents could produce cumulative doses that exceeded annual limits when repeated across multiple work assignments. Construction workers who moved frequently between different projects could accumulate significant exposures without triggering the administrative oversight that would apply to workers who received similar doses within single work assignments. The documentation system fragmentation meant that no institutional entity possessed comprehensive visibility into these cumulative exposure patterns. individual incidents were managed effectively through local resources while contributing to exposure accumulations that remained invisible to institutional oversight systems. The missing information was not lost through negligence but systematically excluded through institutional criteria that prioritized immediate operational management over long-term exposure tracking and analysis. The systematic exclusion of health-significant exposure events from comprehensive documentation and analysis created institutional blindness to patterns that could have informed improvements in work planning, contamination control, and exposure management procedures. The result was a monitoring system that could demonstrate regulatory compliance through administrative measures while remaining systematically inadequate for the comprehensive worker protection that its design specifications had intended to provide. The institutional responses to discovered documentation gaps at Savannah River site followed predictable patterns that often created new categories of systematic bias, while appearing to address the original problems. Reform efforts typically focused on expanding procedural requirements and improving administrative controls without addressing the underlying resource constraints and organizational incentives that had created the initial failures. The result was frequently increased bureaucratic complexity that consumed resources previously available for direct worker protection activities while creating new pathways for systematic exclusion of critical information. The transition from DuPont to Westinghouse management in the late 1980s exemplified this pattern of reform-induced secondary failures. Westinghouse implemented comprehensive quality assurance programs that addressed many of the procedural deficiencies identified in previous safety evaluations. The new management structure introduced systematic radiation work permit requirements that had been absent under DuPont operations. Written procedures were expanded and formalized to ensure consistent implementation of radiological protection measures across different work groups and operational conditions. These procedural improvements represented genuine advances in administrative control and regulatory compliance. Yet they also created unintended consequences that were not immediately apparent to institutional oversight systems. The expanded documentation requirements consumed health physics resources that had previously been available for field coverage and worker consultation. RWP preparation and approval processes could delay critical maintenance activities for days or weeks, creating schedule pressures that encouraged informal workarounds to avoid administrative delays. Worker interviews document the practical consequences of these procedural expansions. The site did not get going on RWPs until Westinghouse was well established. A construction worker stated that they never had classes until Bechtel came on site. The introduction of formal training requirements and procedural compliance measures improved worker knowledge in many areas while creating barriers for experienced workers who possessed practical expertise but who could not meet new educational requirements. The Westinghouse literacy tests eliminated experienced supervisors and craft workers who understood local radiological hazards through decades of practical experience, but who could not pass written examinations designed for formally educated personnel. Worker accounts describe a systematic loss of institutional knowledge during the early 1990s. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were people who were fired because they were doing things in the old ways. They were high-performing people, but they could not change and adapt to the new ways. This transition created a temporary but critical condition where written procedures became more comprehensive, while practical knowledge about actual facility conditions was systematically reduced through personnel changes. Construction workers who had previously relied on informal guidance from experienced operations personnel found themselves working with supervisors who understood procedures, but who lacked the experiential knowledge to recognize when field conditions exceeded procedural assumptions. The implementation of temporary health physics personnel during this transition period created additional systematic problems that were not anticipated by reform planners. The rent-a techs hired to supplement permanent staff during the management transition lacked facility-specific training and experience with local contamination patterns and operational procedures. Worker interviews describe feeling not protected during this period because temporary health physics staff could not provide the informed guidance that permanent staff had developed through extended experience with facility-specific radiological conditions. The expanded bioassay and whole-body counting programs implemented during the 1990s represented the most systematic attempt to address monitoring gaps through improved technical capabilities rather than administrative reforms. Workers received more frequent bioassay sampling, more comprehensive whole-body counts, and more detailed annual exposure reports than had been available under previous monitoring programs. These improvements provided genuine enhancements in exposure tracking and medical surveillance capabilities. Yet the expanded monitoring programs also revealed the extent of previous monitoring inadequacies in ways that created new categories of documentation problems. The improved monitoring detected internal contamination and exposure patterns that had not been captured by earlier systems, creating exposure records that could not be reconciled with historical documentation. Workers discovered discrepancies between their new comprehensive exposure records and the limited historical data that had been preserved from earlier operational periods. The most catastrophic secondary crisis occurred during contractor transitions between 1989 and 1993, when systematic destruction of business records eliminated critical historical exposure documentation that could never be reconstructed through any subsequent effort. Worker interviews describe labor crews systematically shredding contractor records from subcontractor offices. There were all kinds of records destroyed from the offices of subcontractors after they left the plant. Laborers went in and shredded the records, they loaded the stuff on pickup trucks and left. This destruction was not deliberate concealment but routine business practice for eliminating obsolete administrative records during facility transitions. The contractors and site management viewed these records as proprietary business information rather than critical health protection documentation. The systematic nature of the destruction meant that entire categories of exposure information were permanently lost, including monitoring records, time cards, work assignments, and incident reports that could have provided critical information for future dose reconstruction efforts. The development of fault-tree databanks beginning in 1973 represented the most ambitious attempt to address documentation gaps through comprehensive retrospective analysis of available historical information. The databank development team searched published reports, daily teletypes, incident reports, and monthly summaries to create integrated databases of equipment failures and process anomalies that had not been systematically preserved through other documentation systems. When published sources proved inadequate for comprehensive analysis, the team began reviewing handwritten shift turnover logbooks to capture events that had never been formally reported through institutional channels. This effort generated valuable information about previously undocumented incidents while revealing the systematic scope of documentation gaps that had accumulated over decades of operations. The databank effort demonstrated both the potential value of comprehensive retrospective analysis and the inherent limitations that prevented complete reconstruction of missing information. Many early logbooks had been transferred to archives or destroyed before the databank project began, creating permanent gaps that could not be filled through any feasible effort. The quality of logbook entries varied significantly between different shifts and supervisors, making consistent interpretation difficult across different time periods and operational areas. The systematic increase in recorded incidents over time, from approximately 4 entries per year in the 1950s to 1,800 per year by 1982, provided quantitative evidence of the arbitrary nature of previous selection criteria rather than reflecting actual changes in incident frequencies. This pattern demonstrated that much of the missing information had never been systematically recorded, rather than being lost through subsequent document management failures. The attempt to integrate health protection data with operational information in the fault-tree databanks created additional complications that highlighted fundamental tensions between different institutional purposes for documentation systems. Health protection records contained individual exposure information that required privacy protection under medical confidentiality requirements. Operational records focused on equipment performance and process conditions that were considered general facility information rather than personal medical data. The integration effort necessarily excluded personal identifying information to comply with privacy requirements while making it impossible to use the databanks for individual dose reconstruction, despite their comprehensive documentation of when and where exposure events had occurred. This limitation meant that the databanks could support general safety analysis while remaining inadequate for the specific health protection purposes that comprehensive worker protection required. The Special Hazards Investigation Database suffered from similar systematic limitations that were amplified rather than resolved through reform efforts. The database had been created primarily for safety analysis, rather than exposure reconstruction, focusing on events that had operational consequences rather than those that posed health risks to individual workers. Expansion of the database selection criteria during the reform period improved its coverage of operationally significant events while maintaining the systematic exclusion of health-significant exposures that could be managed through local resources. External oversight agencies recognized these limitations, but were unable to address them effectively through regulatory action due to jurisdictional fragmentation that prevented comprehensive oversight of integrated facility operations. The Environmental Protection Agency, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and Department of Energy operated under different legal authorities that created systematic gaps in comprehensive facility oversight. Each agency could identify specific violations within its regulatory domain while missing systematic problems that emerged from interactions between different regulatory requirements. The Price-Anderson Amendment Act implementation created additional documentation requirements designed to ensure accountability for nuclear safety violations. But these requirements focused on prospective compliance rather than retrospective analysis of historical exposures. The new regulatory framework improved future documentation practices without providing any mechanism for addressing the historical gaps that would prove critical for epidemiological studies and individual dose reconstruction efforts. Worker compensation programs implemented during the early 2000s revealed the practical consequences of these reform-induced secondary crises when comprehensive exposure reconstruction became necessary for individual compensation determinations. The Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act required detailed exposure histories that the reformed documentation systems had not been designed to provide. Many workers with clear evidence of significant radiological exposures could not obtain compensation because the information necessary to support their claims had been systematically excluded from preservation during the reform processes. The institutional learning from these compensation cases demonstrated that reform efforts had often increased administrative sophistication while reducing practical accessibility to the information that comprehensive worker protection required. The missing historical information could not be reconstructed through any feasible effort because it represented data that had been systematically excluded rather than accidentally lost during the transition periods. The retrospective analysis of Savannah River site documentation practices revealed a systematic institutional failure that extended far beyond simple record-keeping deficiencies or administrative oversight problems. When epidemiologists and dose reconstruction specialists attempted to characterize worker exposures for compensation and health protection purposes during the early 2000s, they discovered that the missing information represented not accidental losses but the predictable consequences of institutional design choices that had systematically prioritized operational efficiency over comprehensive exposure tracking across multiple decades of facility operations. The Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act created the first systematic requirement for comprehensive retrospective dose reconstruction covering the facility's entire operational history from 1952 through 2007. This legislative mandate transformed documentation gaps from abstract administrative concerns into concrete barriers preventing worker compensation for occupational illnesses. The forensic analysis required for EOICPA compliance revealed the quantitative scope of systematic exclusions through direct comparison between different institutional databases rather than relying on anecdotal evidence or subjective assessments. SCNA's technical review of available documentation systems provided the most comprehensive forensic evidence of systematic bias in incident reporting and exposure tracking, The comparison between tank farm fault tree databank entries and special hazards investigation records demonstrated that hundreds of significant contamination incidents had been systematically excluded from the primary database used for dose reconstruction purposes. These exclusions were not random omissions but reflected consistent institutional criteria that classified events based on operational consequences rather than exposure significance. The forensic evidence demonstrated systematic patterns rather than isolated examples of documentation inadequacy. Tank farm fault tree databank entries described exposures up to 30 RANs, HR during routine maintenance activities, subsurface contamination levels of 350 RANs, HR discovered during construction excavation, and internal contamination approaching regulatory limits during valve maintenance operations. Yet most of these exposure-significant incidents had never appeared in special hazards investigation records because they had been successfully managed through local resources without affecting broader facility operations. The quantitative analysis of incident reporting patterns provided additional forensic evidence of systematic bias in institutional documentation criteria. The documented increase in recorded incidents from approximately 4 entries per year during the 1950s to 1,800 entries per year by 1982 reflected changes in documentation standards rather than actual incident frequency variations. This pattern demonstrated that the missing information from earlier operational periods had never been systematically recorded rather than being lost through subsequent document management failures. The worker interview program conducted by SCNA provided critical forensic evidence through systematic documentation of first-hand accounts that revealed institutional practices never captured in written procedures or administrative records. Construction workers described routine work in radiological areas without health physics oversight as normal practice rather than exceptional violations. Operations personnel described systematic contamination cleanup during off shifts that was never formally documented because it could be managed through informal procedures without triggering administrative oversight. These worker accounts were not isolated anecdotes, but systematic patterns that revealed institutional practices that had developed to manage the practical impossibility of comprehensive coverage under existing resource constraints. Multiple workers reported significant discrepancies between their personal dosimeter readings during high exposure and the official exposure records they received from facility administration, indicating systematic underestimation of actual exposures through institutional reporting processes. The forensic investigation identified specific institutional mechanisms that had created and perpetuated these systematic documentation gaps across multiple decades of operations. The Davis-Bacon Act exemption for projects under $2,500 had encouraged systematic fragmentation of construction work into legally independent tasks that avoided federal contracting requirements while excluding construction workers from comprehensive monitoring programs designed for permanent facility personnel. Resource allocation decisions had systematically concentrated health physics coverage during normal business hours while leaving night and weekend operations with inadequate oversight for the critical maintenance activities that were routinely scheduled during these periods. This allocation reflected rational management decisions within operational constraints while creating predictable conditions where workers performed safety-critical functions without the radiological protection oversight that institutional procedures assumed would be available. The documentation systems themselves contained design features that systematically excluded information relevant to long-term health protection while optimizing for immediate operational control and regulatory compliance. Incident reporting systems focused on events that threatened operational continuity rather than cumulative exposure patterns that could affect worker health over extended time periods. Database systems tracked equipment performance and process conditions while treating personnel exposures as routine administrative data, requiring less comprehensive preservation and analysis. The institutional response to discovery of these systematic gaps provided additional forensic evidence of embedded priorities that valued operational convenience over comprehensive worker protection. Reform efforts typically expanded procedural requirements and documentation mandates without addressing the underlying resource constraints and organizational incentives that had created the original problems. The result was often increased administrative burden that consumed resources previously available for direct worker protection activities while creating new categories of systematic exclusion. The systematic destruction of contractor records during the 1989-1993 management transition provided the most dramatic forensic evidence of institutional indifference to historical exposure documentation as a critical health protection resource. Labor crews systematically shredded monitoring records, time cards, personnel files, and incident reports from subcontractor offices during routine facility cleanup activities. This destruction was not deliberate concealment but reflected institutional priorities that treated historical exposure information as obsolete business records rather than irreplaceable health protection data. The scope of this destruction was comprehensive rather than selective, eliminating entire categories of exposure documentation that could never be reconstructed through any subsequent effort. Workers who had been employed by subcontractors often discovered decades later that their site employment could not be verified through institutional records, requiring them to locate personal documentation such as tax records or coworker affidavits to prove their facility access for compensation purposes. The development of epidemiological studies and dose reconstruction methodologies during the 1990s created new analytical requirements for historical exposure data that revealed the practical consequences of these systematic documentation gaps for individual workers seeking compensation for occupational illnesses. Many workers with clear medical evidence of radiation-related health effects could not obtain compensation because the institutional documentation systems had never created or preserved the comprehensive exposure records necessary to support their claims. The forensic analysis identified systematic regulatory failures that had enabled these documentation gaps to persist without external detection across multiple decades of federal oversight. Multiple agencies exercised oversight responsibility through different legal authorities that created significant gaps in comprehensive facility monitoring. The Atomic Energy Commission, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, and Occupational Safety and Health Administration each focused on specific operational aspects without systematic coordination or integrated analysis of worker protection effectiveness. The regulatory framework fragmentation meant that each agency could identify specific violations within its jurisdictional domain while missing systematic problems that emerged from interactions between different regulatory requirements. No single oversight entity possessed comprehensive authority or analytical capability to evaluate the integrated effectiveness of worker protection programs across all relevant regulatory domains. The lessons learned from this forensic analysis extended beyond Savannah River Site to identify systematic vulnerabilities in nuclear facility documentation practices throughout the federal nuclear weapons complex. The same institutional incentives, resource constraints, and regulatory gaps that had created problems at Savannah River existed at other facilities with similar operational requirements and organizational structures. The systematic nature of these problems indicated that they represented predictable consequences of institutional design choices rather than site-specific management failures. The primary systemic lesson was that documentation systems designed primarily for operational management are fundamentally inadequate for retrospective health protection analysis, without specific design features that prioritize comprehensive exposure tracking over operational efficiency. Representative sampling approaches fail systematically for worker populations that move between different radiological environments, work during periods of reduced institutional oversight, or encounter contamination conditions that exceed the design assumptions underlying standard monitoring procedures. Effective protection requires institutional recognition that comprehensive exposure documentation represents a core operational requirement, rather than an administrative burden that can be minimized for efficiency purposes. This recognition demands resource allocation decisions that prioritize long-term health protection over short-term operational convenience, regulatory frameworks that ensure comprehensive oversight rather than fragmented jurisdictional authority, and information management systems designed specifically for cumulative exposure analysis rather than immediate operational control. The forensic evidence demonstrated that institutional systems will systematically exclude health-critical information unless they are specifically designed with comprehensive health protection as the primary organizational priority. Operational efficiency, regulatory compliance, and administrative convenience will consistently take precedence over comprehensive exposure documentation unless institutional structures explicitly prioritize health protection over these competing concerns. The missing information at Savannah River site was not lost through negligence, concealment, or inadequate procedures. It was systematically excluded through institutional design choices that appeared rational within their original contexts, but that created predictable blind spots when comprehensive worker protection became the analytical priority. The system functioned exactly as designed while producing outcomes that were fundamentally incompatible with the comprehensive worker protection that its stated objectives had claimed to provide. The information architecture and institutional incentive structures had made incorrect decisions appear reasonable while making correct decisions seem operationally impossible. This pattern represented a fundamental system design failure that could only be addressed through changes in institutional priorities rather than improvements in individual performance, procedural compliance, or administrative sophistication. The systematic exclusion of health-significant exposure information was not a failure of implementation, but a predictable consequence of institutional design choices that embedded operational priorities incompatible with comprehensive worker protection. Recognition of this systemic failure provided the foundation for understanding how similar problems could be prevented in future facility operations through institutional designs that explicitly prioritized comprehensive health protection over competing organizational objectives.